By the end of that dinner, my son would lose everything he thought he owned, and he wouldn't even see it coming until it was too late. I was standing in front of a table dressed for royalty, and there was no chair for me. "You can eat outside with the staff," my son said, loud enough for the entire private room to hear. His wife didn't even try to hide her smile. She just swirled her wine and watched me, waiting to see if I'd cry. I didn't cry. I turned to the young waiter hovering near the wall, leaned in, and said 4 quiet words that made his whole body go still. Then I straightened my back, looked my son dead in the eye, and said, "Someone at this table is leaving tonight. It won't be me." The room went silent. Forks stopped midair. The pianist in the corner actually lost his place. I felt every eye in that restaurant land on me at once, and for one long, ringing second, nobody breathed. My son, Daniel, sat back with his arms crossed, chin lifted like a king surveying a court he'd already decided I didn't belong in. Beside him, his wife, Renata, tilted her head and let her lips curl into something that wasn't quite a smile. 3 chairs at that table. 2 were filled. I was the mother of the man being celebrated tonight, and I was the one left standing. That empty chair said more than any insult Daniel could have thrown at me. "What did you just say to me?" My voice came out steadier than I expected, but my hands were shaking behind my back. Daniel smirked. "You heard me. There's no seat here for you tonight. If you want dinner, there's a diner 2 blocks over. You'll fit in better." Renata sipped her wine. "He's just being honest, Helen. Not everyone belongs at a table like this." I took a breath that felt like swallowing fire. Then I looked past both of them, at the boy in the black vest still frozen by the wall, still waiting on the 4 words I'd whispered to him. He had no idea what those words were about to unleash. Neither did they. And that's exactly how I wanted it. "My name is Helen. I raised Daniel alone from the time he was 14, after his father died in a highway accident that left us with nothing but debt and a boy who suddenly had no one to look up to but me. I won't pretend it was noble. It was just survival. Mornings, I answered phones at a law office that paid barely enough for groceries. Nights, I scrubbed floors at an accounting firm downtown. Weekends, I washed dishes at a small family-owned diner 3 blocks from our apartment, my hands cracked and raw from the industrial soap. I told myself I was just working to keep us afloat. But somewhere in those years, something shifted. I started really watching how the diner ran, how the cook timed the grill, how the servers smiled through exhaustion, how the owner balanced the books at midnight after everyone else had gone home. I memorized it the way a student crams for the exam that decides their whole future because in a way, it did. Daniel needed shoes. Daniel needed a laptop for school. Daniel needed tuition. I sold my wedding ring, the only thing I had left of his father, to cover his first year of college, and I cried about it exactly once, alone, at 2 a.m. The next day he found the receipt and hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. "I'll never make you ashamed of me," he whispered. I believed him. For a while I really did. He got into a good university. I cried at his orientation, proud in a way that felt like it might crack my ribs open. But the friends he made there came from a different world, vacation homes, family businesses, names that opened doors. And slowly, quietly, he started asking me not to mention what I did for work when his friends were around. "They don't need to know, Mom," he'd say, voice low, eyes somewhere else. I smiled and nodded every time, and every time something in my chest folded a little smaller. He graduated, landed a corporate job. The calls got shorter. The visits got rarer. I told myself it was just what happens. Kids grow, they build their own lives, and I kept working at that little diner. Not just washing dishes anymore. I moved to serving, then to managing invoices, then to handling suppliers. I caught a wiring fault once before it turned into a fire. The owner started trusting me with more. I read every business book I could find, sat through free workshops on my one day off, saved every spare dollar, and put it somewhere it could grow. Eventually, I stood in that same kitchen, not as the woman at the sink, but as the person who owned the building. By then, Daniel had a house in the suburbs, a car that cost more than I'd made in a year at that first desk job, and a wife who looked at my old dress tonight like it had personally offended her. He had no idea how far I'd actually climbed. He'd stopped looking. And tonight, that gap between what he assumed and what was true was about to close all at once. Back at the table, the waiter returned. He set a small envelope down beside my water glass, bowed slightly, and disappeared without a word. Daniel frowned, but didn't ask. Renata's eyes flicked toward it, curious despite herself. I rested my hand on it and let the silence stretch, because I wanted Daniel to believe, just for a moment, that he'd won. Let him think I was folding. You know, Daniel said, swirling his glass, this one bottle alone costs more than your entire month's income. Renata laughed, sharp enough that a couple at the next table turned to look. I didn't answer. I just smiled. A different smile than the one I'd worn for years, patient and small. This one held a secret, and Daniel didn't know it yet. A man in a gray suit approached the table, calm and unhurried. I recognized him instantly, Marcus, the longtime general manager of this very restaurant. Good evening, ma'am, he said warmly. Is everything to your satisfaction? Daniel's head snapped up. Wait, you know my mother? Marcus only bowed slightly and stepped back, leaving the question hanging in the air like smoke. Whispers started at the nearby tables. Then the restaurant's owner himself, a tall man named Whitfield, crossed the floor and greeted me by name, with a respect Daniel had never once shown me in that room. Mr. Whitfield, Daniel stammered, why did you just call my mother? There's no mistake, Whitfield said evenly. Without this woman, this restaurant wouldn't exist for you to be sitting in tonight. I slid the envelope across the table. Inside were ownership documents, contracts, my signature, on every page. Daniel's hands trembled as he read them. You own this place? Not just this one, I said quietly. I've been investing in restaurants for 11 years, Daniel. You just never once asked what I actually did with my time. Renata grabbed a page, scanning it in disbelief, her face draining of color. I looked at my son, the boy I used to carry to bed, now a man who told his own mother to eat outside like a stranger. Do you understand what you did tonight? I asked him. In front of everyone? He said nothing. He didn't have to. His silence said it all. But the envelope in my hand wasn't the only one I'd brought that night. The next one would decide the rest of his life. I didn't come there to humiliate him. I came because I was done being invisible. I reached into my bag and set down a second envelope, heavier than the first. Daniel's eyes locked onto it like it might detonate. For years I kept you as my sole heir, I said. Even when you forgot where you came from. But after tonight, that changes. I laid out 6 conditions one by one, my voice steady even as my heart pounded. 1. They would volunteer at a senior care home every weekend for a full year, not to check a box, but to actually sit with people the world had stopped visiting. 2. They would leave their house and live for a year on a modest fixed budget, learning what it meant to build a life without cushion. 3. Daniel would work, not manage work, at one of my restaurants as a server, carrying trays and taking complaints from people exactly like the ones he'd humiliated me in front of tonight. 4. They'd write honest public apologies to his company and to a local paper for the way they'd treated someone they saw as beneath them. 5. They would visit me weekly. Real dinners. Real conversation. Not performances. 6. The condition that mattered most. If either of them slipped back into who they were tonight, even once, everything would go to charity instead.
No warnings.
No second try. This is a punishment, Renata said, her voice cracking. No, I said. It's a mirror. What you see in it is up to you. Neither of them knew yet how hard that mirror would be to face, or how close they'd come to losing it all in the very first month. The first weeks were brutal to watch. Daniel spilled trays, snapped at a table of young men who mocked him for being just a waiter now, and stormed into the break room shaking with a rage he didn't recognize in himself. Renata skipped a shift to the care home, and an elderly resident sat by the door for an hour waiting for a visit that never came. I didn't scold them the way I wanted to. I just reminded them, quietly, that a year isn't measured in good days. It's measured in what you do after the bad ones. Slowly, something shifted. Daniel started sitting with an old man at the care home who told the same war story every week, and he listened every time like it was new. Renata, who once wouldn't lift a napkin, began learning recipes from a resident who taught her to cook the way her own mother once had. Months later, I sat them down and asked the only question that mattered. Were they doing this out of fear of losing money, or because they actually wanted to be different people? Daniel didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice broke. At first, it was fear. Now I'm just ashamed of who I used to be. Renata added quietly, I saw the same loneliness in a stranger's eyes that I once saw in yours, and I finally understood what I'd done. I didn't forgive everything in that moment. Some wounds don't close just because someone says the right words. But I opened the door halfway. Enough for a real second chance, not a free one. What I decided to do with the inheritance next would surprise even them. That winter, I split the inheritance 3 ways, a large share to charity, a portion for Daniel and Renata as a real chance to rebuild honestly, and the rest to a small fund supporting parents who've been pushed aside by the very children they raised. I wasn't punishing my son anymore. I was making sure that whatever I left behind meant something more than just money. If you've ever been made to feel small by someone you gave everything to, I want you to know, you don't have to disappear quietly to keep the peace. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse the empty chair. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, stay close. There's more where this came from.